Instantly claiming central space, this pawn boldly probes the midfield, dictating early positional struggles and inviting dynamic counterplay. Instantly contesting the center establishes a symmetrical pawn structure, setting the stage for strategic jockeying rather than immediate fireworks. Challenging the center immediately, this pawn thrust creates a dynamic tension, forcing black to consider pawn structure or immediate piece development. Solidifying the center and preparing for queen's pawn development, this is a typical Slav defense setup. Bolstering the center's pawn structure, this knight establishes a strong presence, preparing for potential pawn pushes and piece activity. Developing the knight to its natural square supports the pawn structure and prepares for central action. Solidifying the center with e3 prioritizes pawn structure and development, aiming for a stable queen's gambit declined setup. Solidifying the center, this move prepares for the bishop's development, aiming for a robust Slav structure. Securing the central pawn advance, while developing a knight harmonizes white's piece play. Bolstering the central pawn chain, the knight's relocation prepares for further pawn breaks while offering excellent support for an eventual e5 advance. Securing the center and preparing for castling, the bishop heads to a natural diagonal, influencing key squares and reinforcing the d4 pawn's central influence. Its placement here is a standard developing maneuver, aiming for harmonious piece coordination. Challenging the central pawn structure and unpinning the knight, this bishop redeployment subtly aims to disrupt white's harmonious development, forcing a decision on how to resolve the pin and potentially creating a target on the c3 knight for later pressure. Challenging the bishop's comfortable outpost, this pawn thrust forces a decision and questions its future role in the evolving pawn structure. Black must now decide whether to maintain the pressure or retreat, potentially losing valuable tempo. Positioning the bishop here aims to castle quickly, but it also passively defends the d5 pawn, which might be better utilized by a more active piece, potentially allowing white to gain space on the kingside. Unleashing central tension, this aggressive pawn push aims to seize the initiative and restrict black's development, potentially opening lines for attacking the kingside if black falters in their defense. Trading off the central pawn opens up diagonals for your pieces, particularly the bishop on f8, while also clarifying the pawn structure that had become somewhat cramped for black. This offers a dynamic path forward, aiming for active piece play rather than a static blockade. Capturing the pawn with the knight immediately seizes central space, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially launch an attack on the weakened kingside if the opportunity arises. Exchanges on the central square, a common theme in this Slav setup, now resolve some immediate tension but also open lines that will require careful handling. Black surrenders the central pawn majority initiative they'd built, potentially ceding space and piece activity to white's queenside development. Consider how your remaining pieces can now coordinate to challenge white's now more centralized kings, bishop, and knight. Regaining the pawn opens up the bishop, immediately contesting the central light squares and preparing for potential kingside castling. Liberating the center with this pawn push dramatically opens lines, seeking active piece play and challenging white's central grip by forcing a pawn exchange that will define the pawn structure for the coming middle game. Casting kingside secures the monarch behind a fortified pawn shield, a prudent step in this burgeoning central confrontation. Safeguarding the monarch is paramount, and this maneuver neatly tucks it away behind a developing pawn chain, preparing for the inevitable pawn storm or tactical skirmish that's brewing in the center. Relocating the bishop to c2 enhances its defensive coverage of the kingside while simultaneously freeing up the d1 square, a prerequisite for the queen to potentially join the central action or support a pawn push. Reasserting activity on the e-file, black now looks to contest central influence and open up attacking prospects for their pieces, potentially preparing a pawn push or maneuvering their rook to a more aggressive square. Bringing the rook back to the central file aims to challenge black's recent expansion and potentially initiate an attack along the open e-file. The central tension erupts as the pawn on d4 is captured, fundamentally altering the pawn structure and opening lines for both sets of pieces. This exchange immediately invites white to consider how to best utilize the newly opened d-file and the potential for piece activity. Black, by taking the pawn, signals an intent to challenge white's central control and potentially create dynamic counterplay, though it also invites white's queen to potentially occupy the now open file, a prospect that needs careful consideration. The board's geometry shifts, creating new possibilities for tactical skirmishes and strategic maneuvering as both sides reevaluate their immediate plans in light of this liberating pawn capture. Liberating the *** e-file * immediately after black's central pawn exchange, white embraces a more open game, aiming to exploit the newly cleared lines for quick piece development and potential pressure on black's king. Capturing the rook with the queen immediately re-establishes material equality while keeping pieces on the board, opting for a complex middle-game struggle over an early simplification. Securing the queen's central dominion with qxd4 immediately challenges the very heart of black's position, leveraging the newly opened diagonal and asserting offensive pressure. Black repositions the bishop to a more active square, aiming to challenge white's central pawn majority and potentially exploit the d4 outpost. The seemingly simple knight development now exerts pressure on black's queen, aiming to disrupt black's coordination and potentially gain a tempo if the queen retreats awkwardly. Abandoning the bishop pair here sacrifices a dynamic potential for a cleaner, albeit less active, pawn structure, potentially simplifying into an endgame where black might find their pieces slightly cramped and needing to navigate the open d-file. The knight's relocation to g5 aggressively challenges the e6 pawn, potentially forcing concessions and opening lines towards black's king, which may be a nascent target even without immediate mating threats. Reclaiming central presence with the knight's repositioning, black aims to solidify their foothold after the exchange of pieces, potentially preparing for a pawn advance or to contest the now open e-file. Asserting dominance over the d-file with this rook redeployment, white aims to pressure black's queenside pawn structure and potentially disrupt any coordinated defense, all while keeping an eye on the vulnerable pawn on d4 should black decide to challenge it. Black reclaims central influence by repositioning the bishop, aiming to bolster the e5 pawn and potentially contest the d-file, a subtle but vital shift in the queenside's positional dynamics. Reoccupying the open e-file with the rook immediately solidifies control of that vital central corridor, forcing black to reevaluate their own piece placement and potentially creating future tactical imbalances. Shifting the queen back to d8 signals a willingness to embrace a more patient, maneuvering game, potentially seeking to reinforce the central pawn structure or prepare a regrouping of pieces for a later assault, prioritizing safety over immediate confrontation. Seizing the open file with the knight initiates a fascinating positional squeeze, aiming to disrupt black's coordination and exploit the isolated pawn. Resigning the pawn's defense with this capture instantly opens the f-file for white's rooks, presenting a concerning avenue for white's attack, while simultaneously leaving black's king somewhat exposed behind a less cohesive pawn structure. White seeks to re-establish central pressure and activate the queen, aiming to exploit the potentially weakened kingside structure black now possesses. Relocating the king to the corner, a seemingly passive maneuver, actually shields the monarch from potential diagonals and creates a subtle escape route should the central pawns collapse. A subtle repositioning, the pawn's advance here aims to preempt any future dark square incursions by black's knight, and simultaneously offers a slight upgrade in the pawn structure's defensive integrity, potentially creating a haven for the king should the center ever crack open. Restoring queen to a more active diagonal, a smart repositioning after the pawn exchange, aiming to pressure the center and potentially support pawn advances later, anticipating a potential rook lift by white. Gaining space on the kingside, this pawn push aims to disrupt black's defensive structure and potentially open lines for white's pieces to attack the enemy monarch. Re-establishing the rook on the open file is a sensible repositioning, aiming to contest control and provide essential defensive coverage for the kingside pawn structure. Unleashing an unexpected queen maneuver, white aims to disrupt black's seemingly secure setup by creating potential forks and increasing pressure on the kingside. Recognizing the diminished attacking potential after the forced exchanges, black reestablishes the queen's defensive post, a prudent choice given the centralized knight's potential pressure and the open d-file, preparing to regroup and potentially challenge white's central control. Shifting the monarch towards the kingside, this subtle maneuver aims to untangle the white pieces from the recent skirmish on the e-file and potentially prepare for a more active pawn push on the kingside, aiming to create space for the pieces to operate, while also offering the king a slight respite from any immediate central pressure. Seeking active play and disrupting white's centralized pieces, this maneuver aims to reroute the queen to a more dynamic square, potentially initiating counterplay on the queen's side or at least forcing white to react to a new threat. Reasserting pressure on the d-file, the rook's repositioning aims to exploit any potential weaknesses around black's somewhat exposed queen and the potentially doubled pawns on the kingside, creating a more dynamic battlefield. Probing for positional advantage, c5 seeks to disrupt white's central influence and open a diagonal for the queen and bishop. Asserting dominance over the queen side, white's bishop aims to restrict black's queen and potentially exploit the a-file's openness, creating an uncomfortable situation for black's queenside pieces and a potential gateway for further infiltration. Opening the f-file with the rook, this piece is now poised to support a potential breakthrough or even engage in a queenside counterplay if the opportunity arises. Targeting the compromised queenside structure, this rook aims to exploit the weakened c5 pawn and potentially pressure the black king once the central files open further. A bold attempt to reposition the queen, seeking influence on the queenside and potentially supporting a kingside advance. The rook's audacious jump to the 6th rank decisively seizes control of the critical open file, directly challenging black's queen and forcing a difficult decision that will likely lead to a structural weakening of the kingside pawn shield. A bold gambit to seize initiative on the queenside, sacrificing central solidity for potential breakthroughs against white's exposed king. Snatching that pawn on c5 significantly disrupts black's piece coordination, creating isolated weaknesses that white can exploit later. A bold foray into enemy territory, sacrificing material to potentially disrupt white's control and exploit the exposed king's position. Capturing the queen with check forces an immediate queen trade, simplifying the position and leading directly into an endgame where white's bishop pair will be a significant advantage, potentially overwhelming black's compromised pawn structure. The queen's sacrifice here fundamentally reshapes the material balance, ushering in a decisive rook and pawn endgame where white's passed pawn on the d-file will prove too potent to contain, even with the material equality it momentarily restores. Capturing the pawn on g4, the immediate goal is to simplify the material, aiming for an endgame where your extra pawn on the kingside might become a deciding factor, though the opponent's queen remains highly active and could pose threats on open files.